gentlemen, to the first webinar of this series, Exploring Climate Solutions, the webinar series. And this is the Equity and Environmental Justice Climate Solutions section. The title of today's presentation is History of Environmental Justice and Racial Policies in Connecticut. The purpose of the series of webinars is to help members of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, also known as the GC3, and the public to understand how climate change affects low-income communities, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color, and other people who are at increased risk due to climate change. In addition, the presenters will suggest what is needed to prevent illness, disability, and death from climate change related to conditions among these and other Connecticut residents. This series of webinars will be held for 1 hour at noon Eastern each Thursday from September 10th through November 19th. The general format of today's presentation will be 30 minutes of presentation, 10 minutes of host-facilitated discussion between myself and the speaker, and then 20 minutes of questions and answers of the audience if we have time, as time allows. So all sessions are being recorded and will be accessible from the GC3 website. We ask that you put your comments, links to resources, and most of all, questions in the chat box. And you'll see the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Please keep yourself muted as we don't want background noise. And I would now like to introduce our speaker. Sharon Lewis is the Executive Director of the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice. CCEJ has worked tirelessly for more than 2 decades to eliminate or mitigate the environmental injustices borne by low-income communities and communities of color, and to provide a seat at the table where rules, laws, and policies regarding environment are formulated and implemented. Sharon's work experience spans more than 40 years, split evenly between the for-profit and not-for-profit business sectors. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees in urban studies from Mount Holyoke College and worked for corporate America in the reinsurance and insurance industry for 20 years. In these positions, she traveled extensively representing the insurance interest regarding major catastrophes such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and other natural disasters. It was her dealings with Love Canal situation that gave rise to her concern about the lack of environmental justice in low-income communities and communities of color. In 1998, she joined Hartford residents as they fought the close of the North Hartford landfill. She went on to work for the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice, which she now leads. Sharon is a lifelong Hartford resident and lives in an environmental justice community in the north end of Hartford. Sharon, please proceed. Sharon? Please proceed, Sharon.
Excuse me. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharon Lewis, and as Dr. Mitchell mentioned, I am the Executive Director of the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice. I must say that I am truly honored to be able to talk about environmental justice for this panel, because I've lived in an environmental justice community all my life. And I'm grateful and honored to be able to talk about my experiences. People often ask me, well, what is environmental justice? Well, environmental justice is sort of like a concept. It's not something that you can touch, feel, taste, smell. So I like to talk about environmental injustices before I talk about environmental justice. Today, I'm starting with the origins of the environmental justice movement. I must also say in advance that my slides are out of order. So with the assistance of Susan Quincy, I'm hoping that you'll be able to see the slides. Susan, can you skip to slide 3? Okay, slide 3. This is a picture that depicts the origins of the environmental justice movement. And it's a picture of protesters in North Carolina, Ashton, North Carolina, to be exact. And what happened here is that under the cover of night, an industrial solvent was deposited on the back roads of Taft, North Carolina, that happened to be in an area where the occupants were primarily African American. Once it was determined, the owner of the facility went to jail, and then the question was, what do we do with all of these chemicals, which were primarily dioxins and PCB? Long story short, fast forward, there were a couple of options. And in a white community, there were 2 landfills that already existed. And in the Black community, there was 1 landfill that already existed, but it was primarily municipal solid waste. So when the whites were offered the opportunity to have the PCBs and the dioxins in their landfill, they protested vehemently and said, no way, it's not coming here. So what the government decided to do was approach the Black community, which of course protested as well. But unfortunately, the governor and the EPA decided not to listen to the voices of the people of color, and they placed the PCBs and the dioxins in a landfill where they lived. This picture depicts protesters lying in the streets, preventing the trucking of these chemicals into their neighborhood. Next slide, please. On this slide, you will see the title that says, why
Excuse me, but the wrong
communities...
screen is being shared right now.
Yes.
Thank you.
Why have African American communities been the dumping grounds for everything undesirable? Could you please skip to slide 16, please?
Excuse me, we're unable to see the PowerPoint slides
Yes.
on
And
the share screen. Thank you.
Well, if
Sharon,
you want, I can talk without it.
Go right ahead. I lost the connection to the screen. I will get it back and we'll catch up with you.
Are we okay to continue?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay, well, I'll just fast forward. Basically, this is the situation. I don't like to talk about the origins of the environmental justice movement because it's a false origin. In order to talk about environmental justice today, you need to understand what happened yesterday. You need to understand the conditions that gave rise to the environmental injustices. So let's go way, way back. And I'm talking way back to the 14th Amendment. But a little bit before that, ever since the end of slavery, the United States government has done everything it could to destroy African Americans in America. Everything it could to put us back on the plantation. As a result, what they've done is determined where we live, how we live, the jobs we have, the amount of money we make, the ability to acquire wealth, how well we eat. They determine our health, and it sounds like plantation life all over again. I was devastated to find out that from coast to coast in America, north, south, east, west, African Americans have been suppressed in every aspect of their lives. For example, during World War I, 600,000 African Americans left the South and went to the North, the Midwest, and the West in search of economic opportunities and better lives. But what most of them were faced with was more discrimination, more racism, and more terrorism. Whites did not want African Americans to live near them, with them, or about them. So what they did was develop racial restrictive covenants in all of the property deeds. And what these restrictive covenants did was prevent African Americans from living amongst white people. Actually, in the deeds, there was wording which stated that you cannot rent or sell this property to an African American. But it gets worse, because the federal government was complicit in this, because federal government, when they financed housing complexes, especially right after World War II, these housing developments were not for African Americans. And within the financing agreements, there were statements like, no Black people allowed. If Black people are being contemplated for occupancy in these areas, you will not get the money. But it gets worse, because not only did they not get the money, but there were always also situations where they were not insured. So here we have these developers wanting to build developments, but in order to get the money to do this, from not only the federal government, but from insurance companies who at that time, even up to today, financed everything in America, from apartment complexes to shopping malls. In order to get these done, they had to abide by the restrictions of the lenders and the insurers. So typically what happened is African Americans were blocked out of decent areas to live, kept out of decent areas to live. Coast to coast. It's amazing how this happened, but it did. Federal, state, and local governmental authorities refused to allow African Americans to live any place other than where they were steered. Now, where were they steered? They were steered in industrial zones. In fact, people often ask me, well, is it true that African Americans were steered to industrial zones? I say yes. However, it is more true when you look at the history that whites were protected from industrial zones more than Blacks were steered to industrial zones. So in keeping with the intention of keeping Blacks on the plantations, as I mentioned, they controlled every aspect of our life. It was very difficult for African Americans to get mortgages, and those who did get mortgages were the exception. But that exception came with a price. And the terror that they experienced would make one think that they were still in Mississippi and still in Arizona, because when they were able, with the help of whites, to move into white areas, they were firebombed, they were murdered, they were terrorized. If you read the descriptions of what happened to them, you would say to yourself, am I reading about Alabama? Is this Mississippi? No, this is Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, Hartford, Connecticut. This was all over the United States. So what happened is, when Blacks were allowed to find a place to live, the rents were so expensive, they had to double up. They had to have help. So eventually what happened is, since they were steered to the temporary housing that the government built for whites, which, as you know, eventually became deteriorated. They couldn't get loans to improve their properties. So here we have slum conditions. We have deplorable living conditions where Blacks are piling up on top of each other. And then we have urban renewal, which a lot of folks call Negro removal. Because even though the intentions were good, the intentions were to improve the congestion, improve the quality of the properties in quote unquote Black areas. What ended up happening was they destroyed communities. They destroyed culture. And with urban renewal came a series of highways and interstates that surrounded African American communities. But more importantly, they have provided a way for whites to leave. So that contributed to white flight. But it's amazing how the common belief was at that time that if they integrated a white community, that would lead to lower property values. But just the opposite happened, because African Americans were not only charged more, but they paid more to live among white people. Now you're paying more with very little income. You're paying more for everything, and yet you're still able to survive by having family members and other people live with you. It's amazing that people think that these people, well, you know, and back in the day, it was those people or you people, chose to live in these areas, chose to live this way. But unfortunately, if you look at the history, you will see that it was a concerted effort by the United States government to impose segregation among the whites and the Blacks. During the urban renewal period, they actually raised areas that were integrated. They actually raised areas where Black people owned homes, and there was no governmental help to assist them with acquiring future housing. So here you have an African American person living in a house, now forced to live in a rundown, dilapidated, substandard housing complex that happened to be near an industrial and commercial zone. But this didn't end here, because now we're fast forwarding to Warren County, North Carolina, and the environmental justice movement is born. It is born because people are noticing that communities of color are being dumped upon. And the question is why? We already have the answer to the why. And we've known the why ever since the end of slavery. It's never stopped. But it's important through the environmental justice movement that we explain to everyone so that everyone understands that these things were intentional. So it is our duty now to make sure that we unravel this tight rope around the necks of low income and communities of color. We unravel the horrible living conditions. We unravel the adverse health effects. We unravel all the laws, policies, and rules that were made that would adversely affect the livelihood of people of color and low-income people. Now, it's very important for you to understand that most people, when they describe environmental injustices, they say low-income people of color. And that is not correct. It's low-income and people of color. It's basically low-income whites and people of color of all incomes. Race is a predictor of where hazardous facilities are normally sited. Right after the situation in North Carolina, 3 studies were made. And of the 3 studies, all 3 came to the same conclusion, that it is race that determined where hazardous facilities were located. So now what are we going to do about it? President Clinton issued Executive Order 12898, which was supposed to make sure that justice was to be included in all environmental decisions. However, there was no bite to that. There was no enforcement to that. So the intention was good, but the reality was not. It's really important for you to understand that environmental injustice, by its very nature, implies inequality. There is a disproportionate exposure of hazardous chemicals that is borne only by low-income and communities of color. Today, that includes Asians, that includes Native Americans, that includes all people of color. But back in the day, the environmental injustices began with Black people, and only Black people, as a way to keep Black people on the plantation.
Alert Alexander Rodriguez.
So now we have a situation where, after the exposed nature of environmental justices in North Carolina, we have the NIMBY policy, where white people did not want anything hazardous or undesirable in their neighborhoods. Well, I call NIMBY any place other than where white people live. That means they don't want landfills. They don't want regional incinerators. They don't want power plants, no sewage treatment facilities, no factories of any kind, no chemical plants, no highways or interstates, no bus depots, no nuclear plants, or any industrial facility. They don't want it in their neighborhood. And because they have the power, and because through systemic racism, African Americans and people of color and low-income people do not have the power, their areas were sought after. Their areas were targeted for the siting of these facilities where the white areas were not. We're very concerned about the cost of living near polluting facilities. What are these costs? The number one cost is the adverse health effects that these people suffer as a result of living with pollution. And these adverse health effects include asthma, various cancers, obesity, kidney failure, low birth weight babies, lead poisoning, hypertension, cardiovascular diseases of all types, loss of jobs and economic viability, a diminished quality of life, and community deterioration, which comes from community disinvestment. All of these things contribute to the negative aspects of living amongst pollution. And I trace it back to the beginning with exclusionary zoning laws, spot zoning laws, where the government would decide, we're going to put a landfill here, or we're going to put a commercial strip here, and we're going to steer the Black folks here. And let me give you some idea of some of the tactics they used, which were just amazing. Black people from the South with no education wanted their children educated. So what's the best way to get Black people to voluntarily move to an undesirable area? You build a brand new school in that area. And by golly, every Black person that you want to erase, eradicate, or eliminate from a certain area is going to move to that new school. But what they don't know is behind that new school is a landfill, is a rail station, sewage sludge plant, is an incinerator. These are all the secrets that this controlled measure of movement from good areas to bad areas. These are all the things that were used to move Black people around. And one of the saddest things to me was blockbusting, and I'm not sure everybody in the audience knows about blockbusting, But what happened here is when the white realtors use scare tactics, like we all hear today, and I can maybe connect the dots. They go around and say, Black people are coming. White people would get scared to death. They'd call up their realtors. I gotta go, Black people are coming. Realtors would say, well, you're gonna take a hit, maybe $10,000 less than what the property is worth. Oh, well, just sell it anyway. So the blockbusters, what they did was, after they sent and paid Black people to drive through white communities blasting their music, they'd pay Black women to push baby carriages around, scaring white people to death because they don't want Black people amongst them. And the reason why is this: in the very beginning, in the 1910s and 1920s, Birth of a Nation had just come out. And that film scared me. Oh my God, it was all about Black people lusting for white women. They're thieving, they're stealing their animals. I'd be afraid too. So they were so scared, they were scared out of their neighborhoods. So what the blockbusters did was they purchased white properties at reduced values and sold those same properties to Black people at appreciated values. The only people winning here are the blockbusters, who claimed that if a Black person moved in amongst you, your property values would go down. But as I mentioned earlier, just the opposite occurred, because Black people not only were charged more, but they paid more to be able to live in an integrated community. But those were the exceptions and not the rules, because the majority of the Black people were steered into undesirable communities. And I tell you, it was quite rough. If I didn't know any better, I think that I was in the Deep South. I think I was in Louisiana and Mississippi. So I'm going to talk now about the conditions, the early conditions, which gave rise to environmental injustices. And you need to understand this, and I would like for you to take this in slowly. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution was to protect and to make sure that Black people, former slaves, were protected, but they were not. In fact, I'm told that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution is the most litigated amendment known to man at this point. Restrictive covenants that were in all the deeds that kept Black people out. Exclusionary and spot zoning. These conditions gave rise to environmental injustices. The legacy of forced government-sanctioned segregation that continues to today. Income suppression and the inability to create wealth. So not only are you kept from moving where you want to go, but we're also going to keep you down because we are not going to give you the money that other people earn for the same job. Unequal, unfair, disproportionate, everything. Redlining, extremely important, because you need to understand what role redlining played in keeping African Americans from certain locations. But more than that, it kept African Americans from obtaining mortgages and obtaining insurance. And I will say that I'm extremely upset by the fact that many of the Connecticut-based insurance companies were complicit in this. Many of the Connecticut-based insurance companies told developers way out in Oklahoma, told developers in Illinois, told developers in Boston that we will not finance this project if Black people are going to live here. But we will finance a project that is made of substandard quality materials. We will finance projects if they are located in undesirable areas, such as commercial strips, such as industrial strips, such as rail and bus depots. We'll finance that, but when it comes to decent quality housing, we're not going to do it. Highway construction, and I call it community destruction, were some of the conditions which gave rise to environmental injustices, because those of you who are of the movement already know what pollution from the from the tailpipes of automobiles does to not only global warming, but taking it back further, what pollution does to one's health. Denial of the Veterans Administration and GI Bill benefits that I'm devastated to find out that a lot of African American GIs still do not use. Because even though whites were given low interest mortgages and were steered toward government built housing after World War II, there was an invisible sign that said blacks need not apply because you're going to be rejected. And then there's the raw deal, I call. President Roosevelt's Great New Deal was a great new deal for white people. But what a lot of people don't understand, that when it came to African Americans, it was a raw deal. Things like Social Security, income protection, they didn't apply to African Americans because the jobs that African Americans had, which were agricultural for the most part and domestic for the most part, those jobs were not included in wage protection or Social Security. So once again, African Americans were not a part of the American dream. Now, I'm going to give you one example of an environmental injustice in Connecticut, and that's with regard to regional waste facilities. Connecticut has 5 incinerators. 2 of the incinerators, the 2 largest, are located in Bridgeport and Hartford. Each of these incinerators, the 2 largest, are located in low income and communities of color with very, very high rates of asthma and other types of cardiovascular diseases. But singularly, each one of those incinerators, each one is larger than the 3 others, which are located in wealthier white communities combined, singularly. Now, what does that mean? That means that the 2 oldest, the 2 dirtiest, the 2 most polluting incinerators in the state are located in areas where poor people and people of color live. And you wonder why there's such a great amount of breathing issues and asthma and cardiovascular issues in these communities. Now, mind you, you need to understand that both these facilities operate 24/7, 365 days of the year. And I found out about 10 years ago that the Bridgeport facility also burns illegal contraband from police departments, not only in Connecticut, but also New York. So if you're living in P.T. Barnum, which is less than 500 feet from the front door of the incinerator in Bridgeport, late at night, you're smelling marijuana, cocaine, and all types of other illegal contraband that police recover. All this is being burned, and all this you're smelling and you're inhaling, and it's affecting your life.
So
The
Sharon,
bottom line is, I'm
yeah,
sorry,
but-
Dr. Mitchell, is my time up?
yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Let's,
I'm done.
Uh,
Thank you.
okay, if you, yeah, you can finish your sentence if you want to.
Okay. The bottom line is that racism, systemic racism, plain and simple, is what got us to where we are today. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Sharon. This has been a very interesting and a great presentation. So I did want to talk to you about some of the things that you mentioned there. You know, as you know, I am a public health and environmental health physician, and I have done consulting with environmental justice groups around the country. And you talked about the health effects from pollution, you know, the asthma related to the trash incinerators. But I find that that's true all over the country. Whatever the community is being exposed to, they are seeing the effects the health effects of those exposures. They're dying in higher rates from those health effects, and they are, suffering from that. So, people see climate change as an existential threat, which it is. But climate justice communities see climate change as another existential threat. In addition to the threat from asthma, from cancers, from other things that they're dying from exposures. But I did want to talk to you about a little bit more about the history of Connecticut. How did so many African Americans and Latinos wind up in Connecticut?
Well, that's a good question, Dr. Mitchell. I don't think you know this, maybe you do. Both my parents were Southerners. My father came to Connecticut at age 5, and my mother came to Connecticut because while she was a pre-freshman at Tuskegee Institute, which is now called Tuskegee, Alabama, Tuskegee University in Alabama, the tobacco industry brought her here. They had contracts with Southern colleges to bring crews of students to the north, actually to Connecticut, basically, to work in tobacco. And they also had contracts with the Caribbean. So we had a lot of Jamaicans and Puerto Ricans and Cubans also working in the tobacco fields. And they got paid, and some of their money was withheld so that they could go back home at the end of the summer and use it for whatever they wanted to use it for. My mother and 3 of her sisters worked in the tobacco fields in Windsor Locks, Connecticut.
Yeah. So there were the tobacco fields were in Windsor Locks. They were in Granby. They were
Simsbury.
in Simsbury.
Windsor proper.
Yeah, Windsor. Yet the African Americans and Latinos are mostly located in the urban areas. Hartford is 80% African American and Latino. Why is that the case?
Well, let me just take a step back because I want people to understand, and some of us know, some of us don't know. Martin Luther King Jr. also worked in tobacco. He came up here for one summer, and one of my mother's sisters had been here in Connecticut since the 1930s. So she and her husband had acquired a lot of land. I have no idea how, but their land was very close to the tobacco fields, and a lot of the students and the people of color partied at their property every weekend. And my aunt would tell stories about Martin Luther King walking around with tweed jackets on, and his nickname was Tweety at the time.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'm sorry, Dr. Mitchell, go back to that question.
Yeah. There actually were a number of very prominent African Americans who worked in Connecticut over the summers. But why is the Black and Latino population of Granby so small? Why is the Black and population? Because you would expect that if people worked in an area, that when they decided to move to that area, that they would live close to where they worked, right?
They would, but that wasn't the case because, as I mentioned, largely in part to restrictive covenants in the deeds, whites could not sell their property to blacks, and blacks could not buy property in these areas. They not only could not buy, but they could not rent. Like my family, I consider among the exception, and I'm still trying to figure out how they acquired so much land in Windsor, Connecticut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but most people were forced to live in Hartford and some in Bristol and commute to the fields in Simsbury and in Granby. You talked a bit about the blockbusting, and I just wanted to let you know that my parents, I grew up in just outside of Ferguson, Missouri, in the St. Louis suburbs. When we moved to that area, we were the first Black family there, and we moved to a subdivision that was being built. And when we bought our house, which took a lot of trouble, and it's a much longer story, they notified the 500 people who were building, who had contracts to build houses in that area, that there was a black family moving in, and they told them that they could have their money back if they wanted it. Luckily, nobody took them up on that. But this is not that long ago. This was in '62. So that happened all over the country. It wasn't
All over the country.
Yeah, it wasn't just.
All over, but if I may respond to one chat, someone made a comment that the larger tobacco companies housed the students in dormitories. They housed the white students in dormitories. There were lots of Polish people and Italian people out there too, because if you're Italian, you probably already know that you didn't become white until the 1940s. The blacks and the people of color were housed in dormitories very close to Westover Air Force Base, as well as Windsor, that looked like these steel buildings that were so hot that you couldn't survive in them very long.
Right.
But the whites were housed in regular dormitories that looked like houses.
Yeah, I think that your point about when people became white is very, very interesting. I will follow up with something.
Yeah, it has a lot to do with
I have
this
a link.
as well.
I have a link with of references that talk about when different ethnic groups became white, and did want to point out that as you said, the Polish and other Eastern Europeans were picking the tobacco until World War I, where they were restricted, and then that's when they started bringing in more African Americans and Latinos into the Tobacco Valley. So let's take some questions from the audience. So if I can ask Ariel to give us the first question.
So the first question is simply, will the slides be shared? And if so, how will they be shared with the public?
So yes, the slides and the webinar will be on the GC3 website. And perhaps we can get the link to that in the chat. But
yes, we will share everything upon your request, including the correct slideshow.
Right. Okay, next question, Ariel.
Next question was a clarification. So Sharon mentioned the municipal waste incinerators that are in the state of Connecticut. Was she only referring to specifically municipal waste, or was sewage sludge also included in that 5 incinerator?
No, I was referring to 5 incinerators.
Trash incinerators.
And I use incinerators because, I'm sorry, trash incinerators, yes, which are primarily municipal solid waste. But my intention was to focus on the 2 regional incinerators that are located in Hartford and in Bridgeport, which are large, dirty, polluting, and dangerous.
Yeah, but the point about the sewage sludge incineration, which also produces a lot of toxics in addition to the trash incinerator, is that there are 6 of them in Connecticut, and they are all located in urban areas or adjacent in towns right next to the largest cities in Connecticut. So that's, again, another environmental injustice. Ariel, can we have the next question?
Of course. So the next question relates to whether Sharon can speak on issues related to environmental justice in the climate context, specifically whether there are lessons or principles from the Equitable and Justice Climate Action Platform that the GC3 should be taking into account.
Well, that's a good question, and I purposely did not mention much about the climate aspect, because it's my understanding that that subject will be taken up, I believe, in the next session, which might be next Thursday. But I will say this, that the environmental justice communities are the first and hardest hit by the vagaries of the climate. These hot summers that we're having are killing people, and the cold winters are doing the same. The energy costs of just being able to survive in a hot and cold environment are devastating to people. So I really don't want to get into it because I don't want to spoil the next presentation, but I was asked to be very, very narrow in this context, and I apologize if I'm not able to go further.
Yes, I'll talk a little bit about it in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from today when I'm presenting more broadly on climate justice and the issues there. But the spoiler alert is that you can go online and look at the agreement that was made between the environmental justice organizations and some of the larger, what we call green groups, about incorporating environmental justice and climate justice into the principles of climate justice. But again, as Sharon said, we'll talk about those as the series goes on. So next question, Ariel.
Next question is there local or state-funded care for children and adults in EJ communities who suffer from the pollution that they live with?
Funny you should say that, because right now, the only remedy for low-income people and people without jobs is Medicaid. And Medicaid coverage is not so good. People are suffering dearly with all kinds of respiratory issues that are not being resolved because of lack of money for better treatment, unfortunately. The state of Connecticut is not reimbursing the doctors an amount of money that they need in order to conduct business. And with a low reimbursement rate comes low quality health care.
Right.
Online, end of story, period.
Right. Yes, it is true that it's hard to find physicians that will take Medicaid in Connecticut. There's some clinics that do, a lot of times the clinics will, and there are, some African American physicians and physicians of color are more likely to take Medicaid. But again, they can't, it's difficult to survive taking Medicaid. I also wanted to talk a little bit, Sharon, you had talked a little bit about the wealth gap, and you also talked about exclusionary housing codes. But I just wanted to point out that the way that most people gain wealth is through home ownership.
Absolutely.
And so it's not only by denying jobs, good paying jobs, but also by denying home ownership and the benefits of home ownership and the access to government programs to promote home ownership.
So that's why I mentioned
that wealth has been
there was a denial of being able to create wealth. And that begins with owning property and having that property appreciate in value.
Right. That's my point. That I think that it's really, really important for people to understand that. So Ariel, can we have the next question, please?
Of course. So the next question is, please describe any advocacy for African Americans relocating to less toxic lands in current states, original colonies, or continental Africa.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question? I didn't quite hear it.
Of course. It's asking whether there are any advocacy groups that are helping with relocation to less toxic lands in current states, original colonies, or in continental Africa.
There are, and I have heard of them, and they're doing the best they can. But this situation is so large. It's immeasurable, so that it's difficult to determine who gets relocated and who doesn't. For example, as Dr. Mitchell mentioned in my bio, I was lucky to be involved in the reinsurance industry 20, 30 years ago. I can't believe it's been that long. And I noticed a difference in the treatment between whites who wanted to relocate and blacks who wanted to relocate. Case in point is Love Canal, New York, white people. They were listened to, and in a short period of time, they were relocated and given adequate amounts of money to repurchase homes. All over America, the same thing does not occur in Black communities. Cancer Alley is one that comes to mind. I believe their fight to get relocated is still ongoing, and it's been over 20 years.
Where is Cancer
Because
Alley?
what they want to do is not only not give these people enough money to relocate, but they want to break up families and culture and blocks. And the South, for the most part, people live amongst their relatives. So if your grandma is on the street around the corner and you live here, they want to just relocate you and not your grandmother, even though everyone is being exposed to the same situation. But
Yeah, so
I'd like to
for your information, Cancer Alley is the area between Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and New Orleans, Louisiana, along the Mississippi River, where it's also known as the Chemical Corridor, because there are dozens of petrochemical plants that are located in that area for both chemical production as well as petroleum refining.
If I may also jump back in, because my understanding has evolved over time. And by that, I'm saying relocation is good, but that's not going to solve the problem. You can't fix what you don't see or acknowledge. That's like we have been living a COVID-16-19, because ever since the beginning in 1619, we have had.
What happened in 1619?
When we arrived in America.
Yeah, when the first slaves, slaves.
You know, it's been COVID-16-19 for us, because racism has been that virus that has been invisible, that has only affected low income and people of color. 400 years of unrelenting racism that has caused immeasurable harm. Now, I include 400 years, but I do also know that slavery only lasted approximately 250 years. But we got 150 more years and ongoing. So it's 400 plus years of unrelenting racism that has caused immeasurable harm to people of color and low-income folks. Because the government says it doesn't exist. Because a lot of people out there say that racism is no longer. But we've also always known that racism has continued. Racism is alive and well. I mean, my God, Jim Crow didn't die. He just moved to Southern New England. He moved to Hartford, Connecticut.
Can you define Jim Crow?
Jim Crow, and I'm glad you asked me that. It's legalized segregation. It's a set of rules and laws, actually laws, in Southern states that determined how the races were going to live. So in the South, when these Jim Crow laws were still active, there were separate cemeteries, separate grocery stores, separate hospitals, separate living areas. If you want to go to the movie theater, the black sat on top and the white sat on the bottom. Now, with the stories I've heard from my parents, especially from my mother, if I were white, I'd want to be on top, because a lot of times the blacks poured soda and candy and stuff on the folks on the bottom. But that's another issue. But these were legalized segregation, where in all aspects of our lives, we were separated. But it was not equal, separate but unequal. There were separate water fountains, separate parks, anything you can imagine, separate, separate, separate. So that was Jim Crow.
Yeah.
But the government says racism doesn't exist, just like President Trump says that the coronavirus doesn't exist. And as a result, there's been no urgency to develop that magic vaccine that's going to erase racism, just like there is no urgency to, at that time, but now it is, to develop a vaccine against coronavirus. We've got to go way back and fix all these things that gave rise to these injustices. And that includes relocation, but it also includes a lot of things.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that we're at the end of our time. So I want to thank you, Sharon, and thank the listeners for your attention and for your questions. As we said before, this webinar will be posted on the Connecticut Governor's Council on Climate Change website under the Equity and Environmental Justice work group. So you'll be able to find the link to our webinars on that page.
But
We
Dr.
will
Mitchell, is there
also-
time for me to make one more statement? Because people often ask me, what is environmental justice? And
Go ahead.
my definition has evolved over time. That's why on the slide, there's nothing there. Do I have time to just make one quick statement?
Please hurry. Please go ahead.
Okay, great, I'm sorry. Well, environmental justice will occur when there is fair distribution of the environmental benefits and burdens, when everyone is equally protected from environmental hazards, and everyone has a seat at those decision-making tables that involve how the environment interacts with our lives. And until that comes, there will be no environmental justice.
Right. And so I think that, this Governor's Council on Climate Change is a step in the right direction. We're doing a lot to include climate justice in these efforts, and we certainly appreciate and recognize the governor and Governor Lamont and the Commissioner Dykes for their efforts to include environmental justice and to change the policies. Through climate change, we're going to have to change a lot of policies. And we have the opportunity, while we're changing these policies, to make them much more equitable, to reduce the disparities. And I think that we should and can do that. So with that, I'd like to end this webinar. And again, thank you all for your participation. We'll see you next week, hopefully.